mode of life cannot continue. Now, now the problem is, I talk about this in some of the chapters of my book, but if you think of the economy having four engines: consumers, businesses, governments, exporters. Well, I've just told you here that consumers, the single biggest engine, are going to be in slow mode for quite a few years to come. Business investment, well, businesses aren't going to start investing until they think sales are going to grow. That leaves government and exports. Well, government, as everybody knows, is pretty stretched right now, and it's going to have to be in shrinking mode. So that kind of leaves the foreign sector. We have to look to the rest of the world to help our economy grow. Now, it's kind of a good news, bad news story. The good news is the rest, our traditional, the bad news is our traditional trading partners, Japan, the European Union, are growing as sluggishly as we are. This is a forecast that the IMF released just a few days ago, and this isn't just the next year, but my purple bar here is 2015. So in their view, this isn't just like a problem for now. For the next 4 years, this divergence between the rich world and the developing world is going to be quite striking. I mean, look at those growth rates in China and India and Brazil. None of those countries, well, Brazil had a very short recession. China, I mean, their recession consisted of going from 8% growth to 6% growth for 2 quarters. I'd take that recession, thank you very much. And that is going to be a very strong performance for a number of years. I mean, this is one of the most fascinating stories, actually, of the last 10 years, has been this, the shift, the locus of growth from the developed world to the developing world. Next slide, please. And one of the positive things I see here on the political front, on the economic front, is the Pew Center, where they will poll people around the world on some of their attitudes. And so one of the questions they ask is, are people better off in free markets? And I think there's really a striking chart here. If you look at it, the people in China and Brazil and India, if anything, are more like enthusiastic about free markets than in the rich world, certainly much more so than in Japan. Now, don't confuse this with saying that those countries have freer markets than we do. They definitely don't. Those countries still have a lot of state planning. Our economy is far and away the freest one. But what I think this tells you, and it's an encouraging story, is that once they get a taste of what, you know, liberal markets can do for their standard of living, they like it. So you'll hear people say that the free market brand has been damaged by the crisis. Don't buy it. You know, everything I see suggests that people make a distinction between, you know, the financial crisis and the fundamental health that we get from a free market economy, and it's spreading. It's not just the United States. Next slide, please. If I could make a small little commercial pitch for my own magazine, this is a story that we've been covering vigorously. These are 2 cover articles we had just from the last few weeks. The first about the amazing turnaround of Latin America from being a bunch of basket case dysfunctional autocratic countries to being vigorous, for the most part, democratic and liberalized economies. And the second one, a very interesting story about how dynamic the entrepreneurial sector in India is. Next one. So this has profound implications for the United States. And I know, you know, Mr. Mary, you're talking a lot about how Jacksonville and this whole area has got to open up more to the rest of the world. This is a very encouraging story. The emerging markets are going to be a big part of who does the spending around the world in the coming years. It's already happening. Between their faster growth, the declining value of our dollar, they're a much bigger part of the world's consumption basket. We're a shrinking part of that basket. And the other good part of this story is that the United States, more so than other rich countries, is already highly exposed to a lot of those growing markets. And I know that this is, I don't have to tell you guys in Jacksonville here, where you have very strong links to Latin America and so on. I mean, far be it from me to tell you how to do your jobs, but I'd say that one of the things that you can do is try and expand those links to Asia as well. I mean, I know the widening of the Panama Canal is going to help in that regard. I realize it's probably a very long flight from Jacksonville to Beijing, but maybe you want to sort of like push some of your airlines to like think about it. But since you got to go where the customers are, where the markets are. And now, what we were talking earlier today, somebody mentioned how like only like 1 or 2% of American companies do like 80% of our exporting. Now that's not so unusual. I mean, it's often the case around the world that like it's like the Intels and the Exxons and the Sun Microsystems of the world, who are the Apples that are really successful. But there's a lot to be said for smaller and medium-sized enterprises need to kind of get into this exporting game. It's going to be a survival story. I mean, let's face it. If your hot business idea was like building, you know, elaborate new kitchens for people in giant houses for the last 10 years in Central Florida, let's face it, that business model is not going to work so good for you in the next 10 years. You got to think about other things. And the United States has traditionally been lucky enough that we could rely on our huge internal market. We could become very wealthy doing that. Well, for a lot of reasons that I've just been through, not just the fact that our consumers are hunkered down, but the rest of the world is growing in an exciting way, that's got to change. Smaller companies have got to think more about the whole world being their market. Next slide, please. A lot of people say, well, export what? I like to show this chart by way of saying that it's not just you know, parts, it's not just automobiles, it's not just aircraft. The United States is a major exporter of services. Some of this is traditional tourism, you know, all the tourists coming to Orlando, Florida, to Disney World. It's also films and other things that we have always been strong at, but it's other stuff. It's like architectural services, engineering services, financial services. Now, I will grant you that the rest of the world isn't beating a path to our door to learn how to make AAA-rated subprime mortgage collateralized debt obligations. Okay, perhaps that's not where you want to, you know, put your money in the future. But that said, like life insurance, property and casualty insurance, you know, American companies actually have a lot of expertise in this area. Next slide, please. All right, how much time I got here? I maybe another 5-10 minutes. Okay. So let's quickly go through the policy outlook. Next slide, please. The Federal Reserve, something I spent a lot of my time dealing with over the years. As you know, they've already brought interest rates down to 0, and as I say in my book, once you're out of bullets, the Federal Reserve is basically out of conventional monetary bullets, but once you're out of bullets, you basically turn to your bayonet. And that's what the Fed's been doing. Their equivalent of a monetary bayonet was to basically buy bonds with freshly printed money. The idea being that this would pull down bond yields and deliver additional stimulus. Maybe at some point, after banks had all this, you know, money sitting in their bank accounts at the Fed earning nothing, they would burn a hole in their pockets and they would go out and invest it in other stuff. They would make loans and buy stocks. It hasn't done the trick yet, but I think eventually it will. Next slide, please. Now, the concern of some people is that all that money printing is going to produce inflation, even hyperinflation. You hear officials talk about, like, darkly about, you know, revisiting the days of the Weimar Republic in Germany with hyperinflation and people buying stuff with wheelbarrows full of cash. Don't believe any of it. And again, I go through this in some detail in my book. But you can print money, but if the money doesn't get lent out and spent, it will not create inflation. And that's exactly the situation we have now. All that money that the Fed has printed is not getting lent out and it's not getting spent. It's sitting on the bank's books at the Federal Reserve. And indeed, total bank credit is actually contracting. And the reason why is, as I said earlier, if a bank can have all the money in the world, but if it doesn't have the capital support lending, it can't lend. If it doesn't have the customers who want to borrow, it can't lend. So inflation is not a problem. In fact, I still worry a little bit about deflation, that there's so much unused capacity and unemployment pushing down on prices and wages that inflation, which is already very low, could become deflation. I don't think it'll happen. I think that ultimately, I mean, the fact that we've had low inflation of around 2% for so many years means that people will tend to sort of like set their wages and prices with that in view, and that makes it actually hard to fall into deflation. The next area on the policy front, though, I talked a lot about how businesses here and elsewhere have to think more about selling to the rest of the world, places like China. But what if those countries don't want us to sell to them? What if they make it really hard to sell to them because of protectionism? And in the case of China, because they have kept their currency extremely low for a long time using a variety of capital controls and intervention in the markets. Well, if you've been following the news lately, you'll realize this is a growing source of tension internationally. The Brazilian Minister of Finance warned about a currency war. Japan has intervened to try and hold their currency down. Brazil has intervened to try and hold its currency down. And the United States, the House of Representatives, recently passed a bill that threatened to impose duties on China if it did not allow its currency to rise. Now, I find this kind of funny because the Chinese will always sort of say darkly to the Americans, well, you know, don't pressure us. If you pressure us, it only is counterproductive. But the fact of the matter is the only time they ever move is when we pressure them. In 2005, they allowed the currency to rise after Chuck Schumer and Lindsey Graham had almost passed a bill in the Senate threatening to punish them. And indeed, they had said back in June they were going to let the yuan rise, and they didn't do anything until Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, started to talk tough, and this bill started getting some traction in the House of Representatives. So my hope is that this gentle application of pressure by the United States and increasingly other countries will get the Chinese to, bit by bit, move. My fear is that it degenerates into a trade war. I mean, remember, Chinese politicians have their domestic constituencies as well, and they do not want to be seen as kowtowing to pressure from the Americans or anybody else. And we've seen this scenario where in situations of high unemployment in many countries, it's every man for himself, and that degenerates into protectionism, imposition of duties, and so forth. I will say that while I've worried a lot about protectionism rising the last few years, this so far has been the dog that did not bark. I'm impressed and surprised by how little actually bad trade stuff has happened over the last few years. And so what I think we have a situation where, as I like to put it, the adults are basically in charge. That yes, our legislatures and others can sort of like, fire a lot of, stink bombs at each other. But when the adults get in the room, they work it out. They find a way for everybody to save face. And that's kind of what I'm hoping will come out of the G7 meetings this weekend. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn to the fiscal policy story here just for a minute. A story familiar to many of you. This is the size of the deficit that we're heading for, 6% of GDP. Obviously, Obama wants to stabilize it at 3% of GDP. Not only does he not have a budget that gets us to 3%, but it has it even growing over the 10-year period. So obviously, we have a big challenge ahead of us. Next slide. Actually, skip ahead one more, please. So one of the problems, obviously, is the spending side. I mean, if you go back to January 2009, just before Obama took office, you can see where the CBO thought government spending was headed to, kind of close to the historical average of 21%. Now you fast forward about 16 months and you can see it's quite a bit larger. Now, surprisingly, most of that increase in the size of government spending is because of one thing, and that's higher interest on our national debt. That thing is the real, landmine in our financial situation. As that number starts to rise, and I saw this in my native Canada 15, 20 years ago, where we got to a point where the interest we were paying on our national debt was more than we were spending on healthcare and education combined. And that is exactly what we're staring at over the next 10 years. Then there's a lot of increase in terms of like Obamacare, increased Medicaid, and so forth, all those things adding to that. Next slide, please. The problem is we're going to spend all that money. How are we going to pay for it? Well, it's one thing to say, well, expenditure is like rising as fast as it has, but look what's happened to the revenue side. The recession really put the kibosh on the revenue pie. In fact, tax revenue as a share of GDP is at like a 60-year low. So now a lot of that was cyclical. We got corporate profits were hammered, rich people who were paying a lot of taxes, they got hammered. So if the economy recovers, as I expect it to do, a lot of that revenue will come back. But it's not going to come back by nearly enough to pay for the increased level of spending. Now, the three lines you see there, the dark blue line is what the CBO baseline is on tax revenue. But both the Democrats and the Republicans want to extend all of the Bush tax cuts. And as you can see, the difference between what they want is the gray line is the Republican position, which is tax cuts extended for everybody. And the blue line is the Democratic position, tax cuts extended for everybody except the top 2%. Those lines are very close together. So I am constantly amused by the amount of energy we are spending over this, whether or not to extend the tax cuts for just the wealthy. It's not a large amount of money. It's like $33 billion. I'm sorry, that's like 9 days worth of deficit. We have a much bigger problem here. Now, I'm just going to say, The Economist a few weeks ago, when they weighed in on this, I'm invoking my magazine, not myself, but they said, policy should be extend them all for 3 years and then end them all. Okay? Gosh, I'd love for everybody to have lower taxes, but frankly, we need the money. So what's actually going to happen? Can you, next slide? And one after this, please. We're going to skip that one. So what does this mean for policy? Well, the only thing that people seem to dislike more than Obama's handling of the economy is his handling of the deficit. And this is actually a very difficult situation for him to be in because right now the view is that the economy is very fragile. You actually don't want to tighten fiscal policy too quickly because given that the Federal Reserve doesn't have a lot of ammunition left to help the economy, you don't want the federal government squeezing things when there's no ability to offset that on the monetary side. But the problem is people are very worried about the deficit, and that takes away from his room to maneuver. This is an interesting slide you're going to see here. As I like to say, the era of big government didn't begin under Obama, it began under George Bush. And since around 2000, you've seen the people demanding more government was rising steadily, and those who wanted the government to do less was falling. Then it all flipped around in November of 2008. And that was because of two things. It was actually mostly because of the bailouts. The bailouts for the car companies, for the banks, for the homeowners. And people, I think somebody did a reality check and they said, do we really want this much government now? And so we're now kind of in this kind of neutral territory. Next slide, please. And one of the things I worry about is